Hello, I'm Miss Julie, and welcome again to Riverside Kids Sunday School. So, what is the worst thing that has ever happened to you? When that bad thing happened, how did you feel? Were you scared? Were you angry? Were you confused? Were you all of those things? And what did you do when that bad thing happened? Did you cry? Did you go to a parent for comfort? Did you hit a pillow? Well, some of you have never been through a really hard thing, and that's great. But can you imagine the worst thing that you could go through? And can you imagine how you might react? Well, these are really strange questions to start a kid's Sunday school with, I know. But we live in an imperfect world, and bad things do happen. We don't really understand exactly why they happen, but they do. And the book of Job, which is in the Old Testament, teaches us a little bit about suffering. It tells us how to look at that suffering and how to understand who God is through that suffering. This book can also teach us things about how to be there for people who are going through one of those really hard times. So let's look more at this book of Job. Job is spelled Job, which most of us would pronounce as Job. But if you really want to show that you're smart about the Bible, you'll say Job when you see that book. Job is a book of poetry. It's not really one of those rhyming poems, but it has some of the overall structure and rhythms of a poem, especially in the language it was first written in, which is Hebrew. It's a poem that tells a story. That story is about a man named Job. And this story starts out with Job having a really good life. He's rather wealthy. He has a big family. He has lots of animals or livestock on a farm, and he has lots of servants to help him take care of all those animals. And most importantly, Job loves God and is faithful to God. Well, that's kind of where our story starts. But some surprising things happen to Job. To help me tell the story, I'm going to show you a cartoon. I think you'll see it's obviously not one that I drew. I am definitely not that talented. But it might help you to follow along with this book of Job. So, Satan, or what this cartoon calls the accuser, went before God one day. God had asked Satan if he had seen how much Job really loved God. Satan said that Job would only serve God because Job had everything he wanted. And Satan told God that if everything that Job had was taken away from him, then he would curse God instead of loving him. Well, God knew that Job would remain faithful, so he allowed Satan to test Job. In other words, as this cartoon shows, the accuser or Satan pulls the rug out from under Job and takes away almost everything he has. So here's what happened to Job in just one day. An enemy came and took away all of Job's oxen and donkeys and killed the servants who were with them. Then a fire burned up the sheep and servants who were watching them. Another enemy came and took away Job's camels and once again killed all of the servants who were taking care of those camels. And maybe worst of all, Job's sons and daughters were all together in one house. And then a wind caused the house to collapse on them, and they died. This is horrible. Can you imagine anything worse than this? And indeed, Job was feeling terrible grief and sadness. And he fell to the ground and looked to God for help. On another day, God allowed Satan to give Job painful sores all over his body. Job's wife wanted to curse God and die. Who could blame her? But Job responded in a really wise way. He said, "Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" In other words, Do we only look to God when we are having a good time versus when we're having some trouble? Now, it wasn't just Job's wife that was going to give him a rough time. He had several so called friends who started talking about why Job was having so much trouble. And basically, they say, well, he must have a lot of trouble or must have all this suffering because he sinned against God. And that's the reason. This really causes Job to question, said, well, I really haven't sinned. So what's going on here? Where is God's justice? And for a good part of the book of Job, they kind of go back and forth trying to debate about God and why these things happened. Well, thankfully, another person, Elihu, does come in and helps Job to look to God. Basically, Elihu speaks wisdom and says, hey, stop being so wrapped up in yourself and focus on God. In other words, look up to God no matter what. Indeed, Job says in Job 13, verse 15, though he slay me, yet I will trust him. In other words, although God is slaying him or giving him some really hard things to deal with, Job is going to trust in God. And that's actually our memory verse. So I'll say it one more time. Though he slay me, I will trust him. Well, God was right. Job did love God. And even with all of this suffering, all this questioning, Job became even closer to God and started to really know who God was and what his truth was. And indeed, ask for forgiveness and ask God for guidance. Later, God blesses Job with double the wealth that he had before and with a new family. Well, I can't say that we are going to be exactly like Job and after we go through suffering, have even more possessions. But I can say that we can all learn from our suffering. Before we get to some of these big lessons, though, I have a few questions for you to see if you really understood this story. So, first of all, why was God proud of Job? Both at the beginning of the story, but also at the end. Now, what did Satan think would happen if he caused bad things to happen to Job? What was Job's response when he found out that his possessions and most of his family was gone? And how do you think Job felt at that time? Can you imagine being in a similar situation and how would you feel? Well, again, in spite of great loss and pain, Job remained faithful to God. You know, good and bad things are going to happen in our lives. And how we respond to those things shows our relationship with God. And how we respond to other people when good or bad things happen to them also shows our relationship to God and what we call empathy. Have you ever heard that word empathy before? Well, empathy is basically kind of feeling what other people are feeling. Another way to think about it is being aware of other people's feelings and being sensitive to them. That's kind of like putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, thinking about what somebody else is going through and making that important and not just always being self-centered. So this is where it gets really practical. If somebody you know, a friend, a family member is going through a really rough time, how can you respond with empathy? Well, I can tell you a few things definitely not to do. One is we don't want to be like Job's so-called friends and blame that person for their suffering. That usually does not help at all. In fact, that might make their suffering worse. Another thing is you don't want to just talk a lot to that person. Sometimes when we talk too much, we forget to listen. So maybe the most important thing to do when somebody else is suffering is to listen to them. Be that person that they can just come and talk to. And don't just jump in with your own opinions. Also, it's not usually all that helpful to compare their suffering to your suffering. They could come to you and say that they're really sad because their grandfather died. And it is very sad. But you shouldn't say something like, oh, yeah, well, my dog died, so I know that's really sad too. It's probably best to just listen to them about how they might be sad about their grandfather, and you don't have to put in your own experiences. Also, you can just realize that that person might be sad for quite a while about whatever they're going through. And you can be patient with them and not expect them to just feel better right away. If we look through the book of Job, we realize it took quite a while for Job to kind of sort through all these feelings and the hurt and the pain of it all before things ended up pretty well at the end. And I think you know that another incredibly important thing and powerful thing you can do for somebody who's going through a rough time is to pray for them. If that other person is also a believer, you can ask if you want to pray together. If they're not a believer, then that might kind of freak them out. So you might just want to pray for them more quietly in your own way. But God hears our prayers, and He'll hear our prayer if we pray for our friends or family members who are going through a rough time. So I hope what we learned from Job is that although we can expect bad things to happen at least sometimes in our life, if somebody tells you that no bad things will happen, then I think they're fooling themselves. If another Christian says that whenever you get saved or whenever you become a Christian, then no bad things will happen to you, I don't think they've read all the Bible, especially not Job. So, anyway, tough things are going to happen to us. And the first thing that we need to do is look to God. Even if we don't understand it, even if we're confused and angry and scared, we look to God because we know that God is unchanging, just like Job did. Also, once again, we should learn to be there for our friends and family who are also going through rough times so we can be kind of like a light to them, or we can show them who God is. So, with that, I hope I've given you a few things to think about. Have a wonderful rest of the week, and I can't wait to see you in person.